You know, part of my background, several years, in fact, part of my path, my evolution, and I'm grateful for this, was through the Scientology experience. Make no bones about it. I'm grateful for that experience. And there's things that I learned, as much I had to unlearn later as I continue to evolve in my understanding of the spirit and mind and the mechanisms and mechanics thus created and experienced. You know, whatever we've been through in our lives is part of what brought us to where we are now. That being said, it seems to come up as a problem that I have this Scientology background and experience, in that some people would seize on that, Scientologists, to claim me as their own, to claim my work as being some rebranded or reworked Scientology. This ain't no Scientology, folks. It really isn't. And so, with some frequency, on my YouTubes and on my website, I will have people make comments in which they rephrase and rebrand what I am saying to shoehorn it into Scientology dogma. And I don't know how much of this is a defensive reaction, because people who are wholly invested in something that comes from somebody else, religious, political, or otherwise, there's always going to be some cognitive dissonance. There's always going to be some doubt, as there should be, in wholly investing yourself in whatever might come from any particular source. It's just not critical thinking to operate from a basis of, if it comes from this person, I'm going to defend it. It's just not a good way to live. It's abdicating your consciousness. It's abdicating your awareness. You know, and one interesting thing that really points this out as to how close-minded these things are, and I'll use Scientology as an example, is that in Scientology, the man who calls himself the founder, he is the founder of Scientology, L. Ron Hubbard, created a connotation for many words that is, in fact, imposing and implanting a concept at the same time. Hubbard took the phrase open-minded. Think about that. What is being open-minded? It means you don't close your perception, your thinking, your awareness to anything without actually examining and experiencing it yourself. Being fully open to all that life can teach you and have you experience. Obviously, that's a good thing. However, in trying to capture his flock 100%, if you look at a Scientology reference, you'll see that open-minded is considered to be something to despise, something to be critical of, somebody who's just not appreciating and into how absolutely correct every word out of his mouth is, as opposed to anything that comes from anybody else. The phrase open-minded is used to describe a mental affliction in Scientology. A person who is considered to be open-minded is practically considered to be an enemy. You know, that's a big red flag. Anyway, getting back to my point here, it is not uncommon for a person to comment on my YouTube, on something on my website, by rephrasing it using Scientology terms, and then to regurgitate more Scientology. That's what a Scientologist will do, just as somebody who is a religious fanatic or a political fanatic will try to reposition, colorize, and project anything as being something to accept because it agrees with what they are invested in, or something to reject because it does not. And there are many examples of this. Yes, there are things I learned through Scientology. Honestly, there are some good points. There are some good techniques. They're not the end all, and they should be examined, open to interpretation and open to evolving and changing. That's called sanity. However, there is much that I must disagree with because it just doesn't ring true, and because on close, unbiased, open-minded examination, it just doesn't hold up. Some specific examples, and if you're not a Scientologist, this might get a little dense or hard to follow. That's okay, because it's overcomplicated and questionable. But just to make the point of where Scientologists will go and how they will try to twist what I say to fit Scientology. I'm going to give you a couple examples. I just recently posted something to say that if you are trying to hold on to some past moment, some past period of your life, trying to recreate a circumstance or relationship newly with somebody else, if your goal is to have something you had before in terms of a situation or condition, you trap yourself in the past. You miss all that could happen for you now, all the amazing possibilities. If all you're trying is to go back to something, it's like trying to go back to the womb. And some Scientologist commented, using his Dianetics and Scientology phraseology, about how when you have what in Scientology and Dianetics terms is what they call an engrammic incident, common language, a traumatic experience, and you need to, as is it, Scientology term basically, I would say, to spiritually digest it, to allow yourself to fully experience all that was in this past moment or experience. Then that's how it resolves. It has nothing to do with the point I was making. It's a Scientologist trying to impose Scientology on my words. It had nothing to do with the point I was making. It's a completely different subject. Again, I was talking about how I see people wishing that they could again have some relationship or life circumstance, which is no more. And it becomes a trap. It becomes a trap because they're not open to how much more they can have now, to a new and different, better relationship, business, job, whatever. It's not about it's not about processing an old traumatic experience. That's not it. Okay, that's one example. Let me give another example. Psychology has a term for this mechanism that we all have by the bushel. Defense mechanism, where we out of hand reject certain things about a lot of different things and in different ways. And it's what I call a stubbornly held protective attitude. And what it really is an effort to prevent the pain of some sort of experience that has been experienced, to close off some area of life or experience. It's always a way of saying, I'm not going there. The door is closed to that. That's something that shouldn't or couldn't be experienced. And while it is an attempt to prevent something, it always winds up accomplishing it. While it's intended to accomplish something, it always winds up preventing it. And the lesson to be learned here is anytime we install programming of how to react to something or how to perceive certain types of things Rather than be in the moment and recognize the uniqueness of every moment and every experience, we lose and we fall into old patterns. If you don't want to fall into old patterns, don't create patterns of behavior and perception and reaction and hold on to them. It's what we call a stubbornly held protective attitude. Now, Scientology has a very confusing idea of this same thing and a very superficial understanding of it, I'm afraid. And they call it a service facsimile, or service fac for short, which is because it's a mental image that's supposed to serve the person. That is so vague and unhelpful. Compare that to the phrase stubbornly held protective attitude that I use. But I don't use a different term just to use a different term. It's because Scientology basically defines this mechanism as something somebody uses to make other people wrong and make themselves right. That is so not the point. The point is that it's meant to protect a person from something they feel they can't experience. And in operation, it serves as a means to reject, to refuse to experience, to not accept. That's what it is in practical terms. And it's something that must be addressed when it gets in the way of processing and spiritual digesting one's pain and fears. It also comes up, and this is something Scientologists don't get at all, when you successfully process some pain or fear, and it seems to return just the same. That is always the result of some stubbornly held protective attitude that says that they need that pain or fear or anxiety as an alarm system to protect themselves, in order not to try new things, to prevent disappointment, things like that. In Scientology, when something is successfully processed, and sometimes it does happen, like I said, there's some value in some of the techniques, absolutely. Although I'm definitely not promoting the idea of getting involved in that whole practice, that whole system. But Scientology, when something seems to be completely processed and then it comes back. In Scientology terms, it means, they say, that you're connected to some evil, what they call a suppressive person, somebody who is psychotic, who is intimidating you and trying to diminish you and make you small and afraid. Scientology has a whole paradigm around that, which is, they call potential trouble source and suppressive person. The potential trouble source being the victim of the suppressive person. And again, the suppressive person being something very evil, what a lot of other people would call a narcissistic personality. This thing people do where they brand other people as being completely responsible for their condition and ruining their life and so forth. And no branch of processing can get a person all the way whole with a philosophy that their condition comes from some other person's effect on them. That's a very superficial approach, and it has superficial results. In life, if you address things that way and you move away from every person you wind up branding as narcissistic, well, you're just going to find more quote-unquote narcissists. And in Scientology, when you get the superficial relief of cutting off people that you've branded as suppressive to you, and you're not then any longer a potential trouble source, you're going to be a potential trouble source and feel suppressed by another person after another after another. It's not really workable, because what it really comes from is having adopted some persona, some way of being that has this narrative of what somebody else is doing to me, and then because they're stuck in that narrative, they have to find, provoke, bring about, or even fabricate such a storyline for themselves. And what needs to be addressed and processed is that way of being that they've adopted, that persona, that identity, that demands that it be able to display that condition in order to be what one is taken on being. I throw these out as examples of why what I'm doing, it's not the same thing as Scientology, folks. And those of you commenting on my YouTubes and my website, I'm not trying to discourage communication with me. But if you're really trying to have a discussion with me, then you don't just go on my public YouTubes or my website to promote what you are invested in. No. If you want to rephrase, rebrand, discuss, that's something you would do directly with me. And I do not want to be associated with these Scientology terms and ideas, because the terms of Scientology and Dianetics aren't merely words. They indoctrinate and impose and implant a concept that is supposed to be taken in upon accepting the definition of the word, like suppressive person, like service facsimile. If you want to read these definitions somewhere, then add the phrase to it, this is what Scientologists believe to be. Anyway, I have friends who are Scientologists that I respect and like and love, and that's fine. There's always going to be people who have their own convictions about religion, politics, or whatever. That shouldn't be a reason not to love somebody, quite honestly. At the same time, don't go to my YouTubes or my websites and use Scientology or Dianetics terms, because that's a form of trying to impose and enforce your beliefs. They don't match up with mine, and that's okay. But I want to keep pure the meaning I have for what I say. I had the Scientology experience. There are things I learned from it. There was a lot that I unlearned, and there was a lot that I uncovered as time went by. To make one more point about the difference, Scientologists do believe this suppressive person, potential trouble source dogma, but I've actually studied where this really comes from. And it's interesting. Hubbard had some very astute, very sharp people working with him to observe and learn and share what they could see about human experience and the mind and the spirit. And they came up sometimes with some very interesting information. And back in 1965, Hubbard assigned one person, his name was John McMaster, the task of discovering why one of the best things ever to come out of Scientology, which was called power processing, why some people didn't get great results or didn't maintain the results. In fact, power processing was such a good technique. I've actually improved on it, looked at what really made it work, and it's a simple thing called spiritual digestion, where you simply allow the energies that are the feelings of experience to be fully felt by you, to notice, allow, and feel the energies that are those feelings, and thus let it digest away inside of you and no longer be there to react to. But anyway, what John McMaster noticed was that some people have what he called magnetic fields. They had an attraction for certain undesirable conditions to be. And so this was getting in the way of their maintaining or gaining a better state of mind through power processing. And McMaster designed a series of counseling questions to help unlock this, to resolve this, which were something on the order of, what condition are you seeking to maintain through provoking some other person to trigger in you? Not a bad question. I've gone a little deeper and improved on that, because that seeking to maintain an undesirable condition comes from a stubbornly held protective attitude. It comes from the identity that a person has taken on, the way of being, that must be able to display that undesirable condition and say, look, this is who I am, this is what happens to me. But, granted that McMaster's research didn't go that deep, it was still profitable in the sense that it recognized that we put out this sort of radar, this spiritual radar, like, who can I find around here who can make me feel this way? And then they set about connecting and provoking that person. It was a fairly good question. What condition are you seeking to experience through provoking another person to trigger that in you? And I'm paraphrasing very much, but that was the intent of the question. Now, Hubbard, this was back around 1965. He was very much trying to solidify his hold on Scientologists because a lot of people were leaving, going out, branching out, creating their own scene, their own business, their own practice, and drawing off some of his customers. And they were doing things their way. They weren't necessarily locked in to making no evolution, no progress, no change. They weren't locked in to just regurgitating Hubbard's ways and Hubbard's words. And Hubbard felt, very, very triggered by this. He's very possessive and very paranoid. And he wants every last dollar and every last mind in his pocket. And so he used McMaster's discoveries and twisted them a bit to change those questions to, who is it that's been triggering you? Who's the person that's trying to do you in? And of course, that's very short-sighted and superficial, because in reality, that person has a sort of a craving to be done in some way, so he can continue to wear that identity, that way of being that they've already adopted. But this, who is it that's doing this to you kind of question, is not very deeply therapeutic, as I was saying, because as long as you're going in a direction of blaming someone else for your condition, it's very superficial. We create what we experience. There's a spiritual truth. And to assign blame or responsibility in another direction is a trap. You'll never get out as long as you do that. It has some minimal value in that you'll experience some ephemeral, some temporary relief by pulling back from whoever the latest person is that you've been triggering to trigger you, provoking. But you haven't changed your way of being, and you'll do it with somebody else after that. But Hubbard had a deeper self-serving motive for doing this, because then he branded anybody who would get their attention and discourage them from being part of Hubbard's flock, encourage them to try something else or something different, is an enemy of mankind, is how he would brand them, as a suppressive person, because from his pulpit, Scientology was the only thing that could save the world and save the spirit, and anybody who would take you in any other direction was just evil and dangerous. And so he got so deeply into the psyche of so many people have cut off their family, their parents, divorced their wives and husbands, because they were brought to completely buy into this whole idea that they must cut off the suppressive persons, quote unquote, in their lives. So these are some examples of how what I'm doing definitely ain't Scientology. Again, I have my friends and people I love who believe in it, who practice it. That's fine. I respect anybody who operates from their own convictions. But don't brand me with your convictions, because you misrepresent me. And some of you are trying to impose your Scientology and your Dianetics on my words and my work. And that's not something that's fair and permissible. So this is why those of you who make these kind of comments, trying to translate my work to de-evolve it back to Dianetics and Scientology, why you won't see your comments and your questions posted on my YouTubes and my websites. They will be deleted. No need to take offense. Just understand, this ain't Scientology, this ain't Dianetics. No offense. It's just not what I'm doing. For good reasons, I do believe. Thanks for understanding.